The church sat on the hill like a crown over the sleepy town of Melgrove. Its whitewashed walls gleamed under the morning sun, its steeple piercing the blue sky as if reaching out to heaven itself. The congregation called it Sanctuary of Grace, but those who knew Father Gregory Mathis often joked that it should have been named after him instead. For nearly 2 decades, Father Mathis had ruled the church with an iron fist wrapped in scripture. To his followers, Father Mathis was a figure of unwavering faith and discipline. He delivered sermons that thundered through the pews, speaking of morality, repentance, and righteousness. But beneath his polished exterior lay a man bound by unspoken prejudices. Though he spoke often of God's love for all mankind, his actions betrayed a narrow lens of acceptance. This Sunday morning was no different. The church bells rang, summoning the faithful, as families in their Sunday best filed into the building. Among them was Lily Thompson, a young mother with a child on each hand, who whispered to her husband as they passed through the heavy oak doors. "I hear there's been a woman camping by the gates," she said. "A beggar?" Her husband frowned. "Father Mathis won't like that." Indeed, Father Mathis noticed. As he prepared his sermon from the pulpit, he glanced out the stained-glass window and caught sight of the figure by the gates. The woman sat hunched, her ragged coat too thin for the brisk morning air. Her hair was unkempt, and her dark skin glistened with sweat as she leaned on a walking stick. A small tin cup rested by her side, holding a few coins that jingled when the wind stirred. When the church service began, murmurs swept through the congregation about the woman outside. Some glanced nervously at the windows, while others whispered prayers of gratitude for their own comfortable lives. But it wasn't until after the final hymn that the real drama began. As the congregation trickled out, the beggar woman stood, her movements slow and labored. She held her hand out to the exiting churchgoers, her voice a soft plea. "Please, anything you can spare. God bless you." Most avoided her gaze, hurrying past her with polite murmurs. A few offered coins, dropping them into her cup with faint smiles. But when Father Mathis emerged, his tall figure silhouetted against the church doors, the woman turned to him. "Father," she said, her voice trembling with desperation, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need help. Please, I have nowhere to go." The crowd hushed, their eyes flicking between the priest and the beggar. Father Mathis stepped closer, his expression darkening. "This is a house of God," he said, his voice cold and measured. "It is not a shelter for vagrants." The woman flinched, but she held her ground. "I'm not asking for much, just a warm place to rest for a while. I've been walking for days, and—" "Enough." Father Mathis raised his hand, silencing her. "You have no business here. If you need assistance, the town shelter is 2 miles east. This church is for worship, not charity." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lily Thompson stepped forward, clutching a small loaf of bread she had taken from the church pantry. "Father, perhaps we could—" "No," Father Mathis's voice boomed, silencing her. "Do not enable this behavior. God helps those who help themselves." The beggar woman's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her dignity intact. "I see," she said softly. "Thank you for your time, Father. May God forgive you." With that, she turned and limped away, her tin cup jingling faintly as she disappeared down the dusty road. The congregation watched in uneasy silence. Some nodded in agreement with Father Mathis, while others exchanged troubled glances. Lily Thompson clenched a loaf of bread in her hands, her knuckles white. As Father Mathis returned to the church, his robes billowing behind him, the crowd began to disperse. But the image of the beggar woman lingered in their minds, a shadow over the bright Sunday morning. For the first time in years, the town of Melgrove began to question the man they had trusted to lead them. The following Sunday, the air around the church felt heavier than usual. Word of the beggar woman's encounter with Father Mathis had spread through Melgrove like wildfire. Most townsfolk were careful not to speak openly about their thoughts, especially within earshot of the father, but the unease was palpable. The morning service began, as always. The choir's voices echoed through the rafters, their harmonies stirring emotions that Father Mathis's stern sermons often could not. Yet, even as the hymns played on, whispers and glances darted among the pews. Lily Thompson sat near the back of the church, her heart restless. She had hardly been able to sleep since last week. The image of the beggar woman's weary face haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed her. She knew others felt it too. Her husband had admitted as much during their quiet conversations after dinner. As the congregation bowed their heads for prayer, the heavy doors of the church creaked open. Heads turned, some sharply, others hesitantly, as the figure of the beggar woman appeared in the doorway. She stood silently, her frail form outlined by the sunlight streaming behind her. She wore the same tattered coat, her walking stick clutched tightly in one hand. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Father Mathis, standing at the altar, raised his head from prayer and froze. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the woman. He took a moment, steadying himself before stepping down from the pulpit. "You again," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "What are you doing here?" The beggar woman looked around the room, her eyes soft but determined. "I came to pray," she said, her voice carrying across the hushed space. The father's lips tightened. "You had your chance to seek help elsewhere. This church is not your refuge." "I'm not here to take anything," the woman replied. Her gaze swept across the congregation. "I only want to kneel before God, to ask for His guidance, His mercy." The tension in the room was thick, every breath drawn cautiously. Some members of the congregation looked away, while others stared at Father Mathis, waiting to see how he would respond. "This is not a shelter," he repeated, his voice rising. "Your presence here disrupts the sanctity of our worship." "Is this not the house of God?" the woman asked, her tone calm but resolute. "Did He not teach us to welcome the weary, the poor, and the broken?" Her words cut through the air like a blade. A few murmurs of agreement stirred among the pews. Lily Thompson, emboldened by the woman's courage, stood. "Father," she said hesitantly, her voice trembling, "surely there's no harm in letting her stay for the service." Mathis turned his steely gaze on Lily, his authority unshaken. "The church has rules, Mrs. Thompson. If we make exceptions for one, where does it end? Order must be maintained." "But faith isn't about rules," Lily said, her voice growing stronger. "It's about love. Compassion. Isn't that what you've always taught us?" For a moment, Father Mathis seemed to falter, but he quickly recovered. "Sit down, Mrs. Thompson," he said sternly. "This is not up for debate." The beggar woman stepped forward, her movements slow but deliberate. "I don't mean to cause trouble," she said softly. "But if you cast me out again, know this. God sees what's in your heart. Not your words, not your sermons, but your actions." The silence that followed was deafening. Father Mathis stood rigid, his face a mask of barely concealed fury. He turned to the ushers at the back of the church. "Escort her out," he ordered. The two men hesitated, glancing at each other nervously. It was clear neither wanted to be the one to remove her. Before they could act, however, the beggar woman raised her hand. "There's no need," she said. "I'll leave." She turned and began to walk toward the door, her stick tapping softly against the floor. As she passed Lily, the young woman reached out and pressed a loaf of bread she'd been holding into the beggar's hands. "Take this," Lily whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. The beggar paused, her gaze softening as she looked at Lily. "Thank you," she said. "God bless you." With that, she exited the church, her figure disappearing into the bright morning light. The congregation sat in stunned silence. For the first time, Father Mathis looked uncertain. He returned to the pulpit, his sermon forgotten, and instead delivered a terse benediction. As the church emptied, the conversations began. Whispers of discontent mingled with quiet admiration for the beggar woman's courage. Lily Thompson, walking home with her family, made a silent vow to do more. For in her heart, She knew this wasn't the end of the story. In the days that followed, the town of Melgrove felt the ripple effects of the confrontation at the church. The story of the beggar woman's ousting spread like wildfire through the community, dividing the once unified congregation. While many sided with Father Mathis, arguing that rules were meant to be upheld for the sanctity of the church, others felt uneasy, questioning the morality of the father's actions. Lily Thompson was one of the latter. She couldn't stop thinking about the beggar woman, the quiet dignity with which she had stood her ground, and the sadness that had flickered in her eyes as she left the church. Lily's heart weighed heavy with guilt. The more she reflected on the incident, the more she realized that the words of the woman had struck a deeper chord than she had initially understood. The woman had come to the church seeking refuge, not for herself, but for her soul. And yet, the very institution that was supposed to embody love had turned her away. Lily couldn't let it rest. The following Sunday after service, she sought out Father Mathis. She found him alone in his study, surrounded by stacks of old books and faded prayer cards. His expression was stern, but there was a weariness in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and troubled thoughts. "Father," Lily said, her voice quiet but firm, "can we talk?" Father Mathis looked up from his desk, surprised by her visit. "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. What's on your mind?" Lily took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been thinking about what happened last Sunday, and I have to say, I don't think we did the right thing." Mathis's face hardened, but Lily pressed on. "I understand the need for order, Father, but there's a difference between discipline and compassion. The woman came to the church because she needed help, not judgment, and we turned her away." Father Mathis opened his mouth to protest, but Lily continued, "I know it wasn't easy, but what's the point of all our faith if we don't show kindness to others? Isn't that what Christ taught us? To love one another, to care for the stranger and the needy?" The father lowered his gaze, and for the first time, his stern expression faltered. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what came over me, Lily. It's just that." He trailed off, his voice heavy with emotion. "I was raised to believe that people like her." He paused, and Lily saw the internal struggle in his eyes. "I was raised to believe that people like her don't belong in a place like this." Lily took a step closer. "But that's not true, Father. She's a child of God, just like any of us. And the church, this church, should be a place of refuge for everyone, not just the ones who look like us, or act like us, or have what we have." For a long moment, there was silence. The weight of her words hung in the air, pressing against the walls of the room. Father Mathis stared at the floor, lost in thought. Finally, he looked up at Lily. "You're right," he said quietly. "You're absolutely right." The following Sunday, as the congregation gathered for worship, something was different. There was a quiet sense of anticipation in the air, as if something was about to shift. When Father Mathis took to the pulpit, his usual commanding presence was still there, but there was a softness to his tone that hadn't been there before. "My friends," he began, his voice steady but filled with sincerity, "today I stand before you with a heavy heart. I've made mistakes, and last week I made one that I deeply regret." The congregation shifted uncomfortably, many of them unsure of what to expect. But Mathis continued, "I turned away someone who needed our help, someone who came to this church not for charity, but for grace. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and for that, I ask for your forgiveness." A ripple of murmurs spread through the pews. Some looked at each other in surprise, others with a hint of skepticism. But there was one thing that was undeniable. The Father was speaking from the heart. "I will do better," he said, his voice growing stronger. "This church will open its doors to all who seek sanctuary, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what they look like. For we are all children of God." With that, he stepped down from the pulpit and turned to the doors. The congregation watched in stunned silence as Father Mathis opened the church doors and stepped outside. And there, standing at the entrance, was the beggar woman. She had returned. The father walked up to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and hope. Without a word, he took her hand, leading her back into the church. As the congregation watched, some stood, others simply wiped away tears. But all felt the heavy weight of the transformation taking place before their eyes. The beggar woman was no longer an outsider. She was part of the community, and as the doors of the church closed behind them, the sound of a single bell rang out, a symbol of reconciliation, of healing, and of the beginning of a new chapter for the sanctuary of grace. Conclusion. From that day forward, things changed in Melgrove. Father Mathis became a different man. He still preached with conviction, but now there was an openness in his sermons, a warmth that hadn't been there before. The church became a place of true sanctuary, not just for the affluent and respectable, but for all who sought God's grace. The beggar woman, whose name was Ruth, was welcomed with open arms. She became an advocate for the marginalized, helping those who had once been cast aside by society. And while she never sought recognition, her presence became a quiet reminder to all of the power of kindness, forgiveness, and faith. And as for Lily Thompson, she had learned a valuable lesson. Compassion was more than just a belief. It was an action, and in that action, true change could be made. The doors of the church were open to all, as they should have been from the very beginning. For in the end, it was love, not rules, that would lead the way.